This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Monterey Bay Public Radio. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. Before I begin the program, I want to say that this hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. The number of this program of World Watchers is number 845, February 15th, 1988. If you're not used to listening to Mae Brussell, I suggest that you do it continuously for 3, 4, 10 weeks and get used to the lingo. It goes pretty fast, and it gets faster as the hour is completing, the first hour, because I have so much material to share with you. Hang in there. You won't remember all the names. Some, like last week, are repeated purposely to hope that you remembered at least what I was saying. If not the names, get the gist of the idea of E.F. Hutton, Merrill Lynch, and Oral Celik, and Bakir Celik. New names to you, some of them, some aren't, and at times I do repeat on purpose because these are difficult names to remember, and there were certain points I wanted to get fixed into your heads, hopefully, because we can build upon those, and I've talked about them in the past. A lot of people wonder if I ever have good news to share. Well, I have a suggestion, some names for rejoicing, at least a little bit. House Speaker Jim Wright has appointed 2 new members to the Select Committee on Intelligence, and according to the Washington Times, it's very nervous about this. They're both liberals. Can you imagine? One is Representative Bill Richardson from New Mexico, a Democrat, and the other is Representative Nicholas Mavroules, Mavroules, from Massachusetts, a Democrat, and this will be at a time when financial aid to oppose Jonas Savimbi in the Angola struggle may come to a vote. There are 2 new appointments to the House Intelligence, the Select Committee on Intelligence. So maybe just as the Contra aid was turned down, we may stop that bloody war in Angola and let the people decide themselves who they want to run Angola. Leo Ryan was the congressman that fought the Angolan funding of the rebels that were trying to overthrow Angola when they had their own process of who they wanted to be running the country, and it involved people that were later named in Jonestown operation, and then the payment for Leo Ryan's fighting this operation and having the Use Ryan bill involved his own murder down in Jonestown later. Let's hope that the people that have this new intelligence committee have a better life expectancy, but it's dangerous to take these positions. There's an article in the Los Angeles Times and San Francisco Chronicle this week, February the 11th, 1988, regarding the Presidio trial on the military base, the charges against Gary Hambright, a person that worked at the daycare center. He was charged with child abuse, and as the weeks and months go on, they keep whittling down this case that originally started with approximately 57 children, and several weeks ago, or last week, I mentioned they tossed out 5 of the original 12 counts, and this week they threw out everything except 1 count of child abuse. This was a Baptist minister who he said he was a minister, took care of the children at the military base, and they're literally taking away the charges of this case. They're only leaving 1 count charging Hambright with oral copulation with an individual minor, even though a large percentage of those children had venereal disease. Have it now, I suppose. He worked as the child supervisor from June 85 to November 86, and most of the charges have been dropped, showing how hard the government wants to protect people that are doing child molestations on a military base, and using, of course, the courts to protect the very people who've been named by the children, identified by the children, and there are a lot of reasons to believe that these things happen to them. So now he's down to 1 count, which means that he can't be penalized for very much if it was just one count. So we'll see what happens with that story. Last week I was describing the death of a man, James Thurberge, 57 years old, who died in Montego Bay over in Jamaica, and that he was very close to George Bush. He was an advisor to George Bush on drug traffic. He was trained in Heidelberg, went with the CIA just about that time period, and was the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Argentina, to Nicaragua, and to Chile, three favorite American dictatorships, while he was an advisor to drugs to George Bush on drug traffic. Now, his death just took place January 25th, 1988, 3 weeks ago, and all of a sudden in the news, if you followed those very interesting hearings regarding Noriega in Panama and two primary witnesses, or three that I'll talk about in a moment, that testified, the name George Bush came up through those hearings quite frequently. A former aide to George Bush, Vice President Bush, said that Bush interfered with the plans to get rid of Noriega just this past January, and he proposed an alternative way to keep Noriega in office. You're hearing hundreds of millions of dollars went through the Panamanian banks, and millions to Noriega, and George Bush wanted to keep him in office, and he sent retired Admiral Daniel Murphy, who was Bush's chief of staff until 1985, who became a consultant, who works with Tongson Park, Reverend Mooney's right-hand man, and sent them down to Panama and told Noriega to cool his act and keep things a little quieter and try to stay in office, and they would take care of him later. Mr. Blandon quoted Noriega as saying that in November, past November, there was a meeting between Mr. Murphy, and he claimed he was the emissary of George Shultz, and our National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General Colin Powell, who was part of the NSC Ollie North Destruction of Evidence operation before he got promoted. And the State Department and the National Security Council briefed Murphy, and Murphy spoke with Vice President Bush's National Security Advisor, Donald Gregg, another fellow wrapped around the drug traffic in El Salvador and South America in general, and scandalous connections to the White House with Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez. And Donald Gregg knew about the meetings with Noriega, and Bush was trying to protect Noriega, keep him in office. And Murphy was accompanied to these meetings, as I say, by South Korean lobbyist Tongson Park, who was named in congressional scandals just a few years ago, bribing members of Congress. And according to the Los Angeles Times, February the 11th, Panama, this is what the deal was that Tongson Park and Mr. Murphy, the Admiral Murphy, were making with George Bush, Vice President, as the man they were allegedly speaking that he would suggest that Noriega tone down and he would help him in office. In addition to these conversations, Panama, this was part of the deal, would restore press freedom and civil rights and grant amnesty for political crimes. And according to Mr. Blandon, who testified against Noriega this past week, Admiral Murphy and Tongson Park also pledged to secure Japanese economic assistance for Panama. Japan would support Panama economically. Remember, or maybe you don't remember, the programs I did just about 6 months ago that Henry Kissinger was arranging for Japan to rebuild the Panama Canal. Remember, that was our enemy in World War II. We're financially dependent upon them now. They're bailing out our banks and putting up the money. And Tongson Park, who is so close to Reverend Moon's godfather is Ryosha Sasakawa, the Japanese war criminal who founded the Moon Church. Tongson Park and Admiral Murphy arranging for Japan to build up Panama, making deals with Noriega. There is something very sinister in this combination of Korea and Japan, telling Noriega to hang in there, representing Mr. Murphy formerly being with George Bush, Admiral Murphy, and then going down to Panama and wanting to keep Noriega in. And if you listen to the stories of the people who testified this past week and all the drug traffic that was going on, and yet Mr. Gregg and George Bush and his emissaries were down there with Tongson Park. Now, the story of narcotics in Southeast Asia, in Burma and in Colombia and so forth and the Golden Triangle and the money going to Italy, the pizza connections are not new stories. They are old stories. I've watched them before, had them on the air for many years. I just pulled out two articles to give an example of how long ago all of this was going on. Jack Anderson, 1973, September 13th, 1973, had a story, Opium Proposal. The colorful Shan guerrillas, and those are the groups run by Kung San now, offered to sell the United States all their opium poppies. This is 1973, cut down 400 tons of high-grade Asian opium coming to the United States. We paid Turkey to stop their Turkish opium. 75% of the supply of heroin in the United States would have been cut off, except that the powers that be in Washington, again, said blow away. This was as early as 1973, and look how much opium and heroin has come into the United States since that time, and come in through people like Theodore Shackley, identified by Kung Sa, and Richard Armitage, are now Deputy Director of Defense Department under Frank Carlucci, who has taken over Fred Eakley's position. He's been promoted. And the Shan emissary, the group in Burma, wanted to stop the opium coming into this country as early as 1973. Now, that's important because last week I mentioned that the Golden Triangle opium, the opium coming in from Kung Sa, whose name is Chang Chi Fu, was tied into the Mr. Musalulu, Oral Celik, who was getting money through Mr. Waradal in Switzerland from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch. So this Golden Triangle explosion of narcotics into the United States went into the hands of the CIA. It went into the banks in Switzerland, into the banks in New York City, and all over. The witnesses, particularly one, Mr. Rodriguez, talked, just named 3 or 4 banks that are involved in the drug traffic operations. So that years ago this could have been tied up, but even today the money has been flowing right into those accounts, into Switzerland, and into the man who then got Ajah, Ali Mehmet Ajah, out of the jail in Turkey and located him in various places until he was at St. Peter's and shot the Pope in May of 1981. So all of that could have been stopped, except it's been going on in the hands of the same people. And then I pulled out one of my articles, earlier articles, on is New York Times on the drug problem, the heroin traffic coming in to the United States, New York and New Jersey and so forth. The same people that were exposed by Judge Kaufman's Crime Commission in 1982. He started the work, and by 1984, and these are the same people connected to the money going to Switzerland from Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton and other banking houses. This article from New York Times is titled, Mob Said to Invade the Pizza Industry, and it details in 1980 what was happening. Don Reagan was chairman of E.F. Hutton for 12 years. And in 1979, I pointed out the explosive year that the houses of E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch were sending money to Paul Waradell and Oral Celik. And 1 year later, there were long articles about the heroin, pizza connections, and drug traffic. It already can be identified as going on 1 year. In 1980, that happened. Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, and one of the chairmen for 12 years of a banking firm identified with this was made Secretary of the Treasury. And as I said before, the Treasury was the branch of the government that would have been responsible for checking that out. So these are articles to indicate that a long time before these big stories broke on drugs, all of this could have been prevented, except that the people doing the drug traffic are high up in Washington and maintain their security by not only what they know, but the banks depend upon the deposits in order to hold together. Now, some of the most dramatic and interesting testimony that I've ever heard on television, televised hearings, or read about were the hearings before John Kerry's committee. He's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism and Narcotics. And there was testimony from Joseph Blandon, a former associate of Panama leader Manuel Noriega, and Ramon Milian Rodriguez, the accountant with the Medellin cartel, describing the bank, the drug flowing into every single bank in Panama, how he worked with the CIA, how he worked with the Contras, and for all purposes, it was $1 million vindication of the lawsuit that the Christic Institute has next month. John Kerry's committee, the same committee, is going into the CIA Contra drug connections, and this is a good way for Daniel Sheehan's lawsuit to begin, because here are people testifying to the fact that they paid the Contras and the anti-Castro Cubans, and he testified about putting money in the First Boston Bank, the Citicorp, the Bank of America. I'll do more on those banks in a few minutes. But the thing that was so scary about these hearings, and I taped them off the screen, off the TV, I listened to them, I put them on the cassettes, I listened to them twice, the full hearings. What was scary about it was that the only reason it seems that they're closing in on the drug connections at this time are because people like Noriega might have shared some of the drug profits with the leftists in El Salvador, with the M19s in Colombia, with Fidel Castro. If the far right is doing the drug traffic, if the Nazis and the fascists do it, nothing happened when Klaus Barbie was doing it with the top people of Bolivia who were big fundraisers for the Republican Party. That was okay. Once Klaus Barbie and Mates and Gomez were out of Bolivia, then America sent troops to end the drug traffic in Bolivia. The bottom line is that the communists and leftists can't get their hands on the drug money. Mr. Rodriguez said that, but he also told about the very fascists in Colombia, those lovers of the Nazi parties like the Medellin cartel and the group that he was familiar with. He didn't call them Nazis, he called them the hardest killers. Hung people up on trees, cut out their stomachs. These are the stories of the quartered man, people chopped up and displayed for public purposes, so that the far right, the stone killers, he referred to them as the meanest, use terrorism to control the drug profits because they call that capitalism. He says, I've studied fascism and capitalism. Capitalism is cutting people up throat to throat, slitting their throats, and so forth, publicly displaying them, as did the Ustashi in Yugoslavia during the war. And what I got out of this was a fear that the leftists may use the drug money like the right wing has done since World War II, when Lucky Luciano was allowed to leave prison and go to Italy and set up the drug networks after World War II. Now, John Kerry was praising CIA Director William Webster. Oh, he's so wonderful. He even fired a couple of CIA, and he said, I have the finest regard for him. Webster is a racist, singling out the blacks, as evidenced in a lot of material that's come out recently. He set up that dismal scam operation. His agent, Oliver Buck Revell, works with Ollie North on the covert action terrorism, agent provocateur monkey business, where a lot of people are sacrificed so they can talk their terrorism inside out. And John Kerry knows that William Webster stopped the investigation as head of the FBI director in Miami, stopped the Christic Institute, told the FBI not to go into the Miami connections of the drug after the Eden Pastora operation when he was almost killed, and the Christic suit filed their case in Miami. They laid off, and Webster has been very much a part of sending people back to the death squads in El Salvador, breaking into offices, taking the list of people's names, and there are tape recordings. One witness who worked for him testified that he not only was breaking into these groups, Mr. Frank Varelli testified February 26, 1987, as an ex-FBI informant, what the FBI was doing. John Kerry praised him, and it's very dangerous. We have to watch, even as they open up the investigation, we have to watch what they're doing. And then what was scary was that Senator Kerry asked Mr. Rodriguez, do you ever regret, when you look at this, what you did, that you used that brain of yours that God gave you, obviously a good brain? This is what he asked him. And Rodriguez said, let me say this, Senator. There is some mitigation to my life. I didn't come here to bury Caesar, but to praise him. I think later on you will find that I am not entirely as bad as I seem, sort of the argument of Adolf Hitler fighting communism. And Kerry said, are you sorry for the path you chose? The years you're serving now, he's supposed to have 45 years in the clink. I bet he gets 4. He said, do you feel a sense of waste? And he answered, do you say that I lost something? and it could have been different. He said, Senator, I can only live with people who are willing to do moral, reprehensible acts for ends that are in the best interest of our ideology. Our ideology. Think of that. And the ideology of the Medellin cartel that keep the pictures of Hitler and Mussolini and a statue of John Lennon with bullets in it. He said, we use the justifiable means to break the law. And in court, we pay. That's the way it is. We live and we're willing to do moral, reprehensible acts for ends that are in the best interest of our ideology. We use the justifiable means to break the law, and if we go to court, we pay for it, but we're going to do that. And that is really scary. The two senators questioning him or listening to the testimony, one was, say, John Kerry, and the other was New York Republican Alphonse D'Amato, responsible for covering up the Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie cocaine connections and agreeing a sellout that Mengele died in 1979 without any actual proof that that was Joseph Mengele that was dunked into the water and put into an unmarked grave in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Now, last week, I was talking, as I say, about Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton and their deposits into the Swiss account of Mr. Waradell that went to Bekir Celik. And I want to go one step further with people that shot the Pope that were involved in drug traffic and take it to France. I haven't done the French part, and that hasn't been stressed on, it hasn't been exposed really at all. And I want to do the rest of the evening with you and the implications of this story, because this weaves a tale that covers a lot of things that are in the news now. And go to the French story. Jonathan Marshall, in his newsletter Parapolitics, quoted two French newspapers regarding the Alieja affair at the time, investigating who shot the Pope. French author Alain Guérin has revealed interesting information as the basis of their trial. Former SDECE, that's the French equivalent of our Central Intelligence Agency, former SDECE, now called the DGSE. The director of that is Alexandre deMARENCHES, Marenches. And David Emery sent me this material, some of the material on Marenches. Some I had, but we put this together. Alexandre deMARENCHES was the head of the French intelligence until about a year ago. He and his personal assistant, Maurice Léon Bicot, were asked 6 questions by the Italian justice involving the shooting of the Pope. Marenches, as head of the French CIA, and his 6 assistants refused on the grounds of national security to answer any of the questions. There was a French role in the the money that came from the United States to Switzerland and to Oral Celik and to the shooting of the Pope, the distribution of the money. In another article in the French magazine Revolution, it's out of Paris, February the 9th, 1985, Guérin described in detail the ties between Alieja, the extreme right Grey Wolves, the Turkish National Action Party, and also the links of that party to writer Claire Sterling, a woman who's given many lies on the Bulgarian-Russian connections to shooting the Pope, and also that Oral Celik, this is the gentleman that received the money from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, met with Italian terrorist Stefano Della Calle in Miami, Florida, in April of 1981. And, of course, Della Calle worked with the P2, Licio Gelli, Francesco Pazienza, Otto Scorzeni in a strategy of tension and setting up death squads. And the head of the French intelligence and 6 agents refused to ask questions about their role with the shooting of the Pope. And Mr. Marenches is named in conjunction with that with the French intelligence. And in a magazine called In These Times that comes out twice a month, this is September 24th, 1986, there's an article about who Mr. Marenches is. And I bring this up at this time because of the possible links to Aja, the American banks, and to Ronald Reagan and the National Security Council. Mr. Marenches, Alexandre deMARENCHES, formerly head of the SDECA, now was from November 1970 to 1981, had that position. He used to be quiet and out of sight, but now he's promoting what he calls his geopolitical viewpoint in order to build the free world institutions because of the necessity of a global world war, a war against the Soviet Union. A total war is necessary. Marenche wants France to set up a National Security Council, and think of Germany and France literally merging their two armies just in the past month and joining together with their neutron warheads as well as other weapons. Marenche wants France to have a National Security Council like the United States to carry on the Third World War. He considers himself he's a member of the Knights of Malta. He considers himself a person who is a team player in the group that want this large world war. And Marenche, Alexandre Marenche, is half American. His mother's American. His father was best friends with George Marshall during the war. He's a close friend of Alexander Haig. They're both Knights of Malta, knighted by the Vatican. Marenche takes credit for setting the course of President Reagan's foreign policy. The French intelligence set the course. The French CIA, SDECE, set the course for Reagan's foreign policy. I explained one day to Reagan the 8 strategic raw materials that are indispensable in war. As in peacetime, America controls only 4. The Russians have 8. We need this war, of course, against the Soviet Union. Marenche has visited Reagan in California. He said Reagan didn't know much about world strategy. He took out his maps. He said he's a good friend of Jonas Savimbi. That's from Angola, the one the vote will be coming soon to give the money to him or not to give it. And this article says the United States has the means to carry out a grand strategy. They have no experience or imagination or continuity because you are troubled by elections every 4 years. And Marenche says his philosophy is futile. He sees himself carrying out the tradition of noble families, serving kings and monarchs. He helped advise the King of Spain, the late Shah of Iran, the Saudi Arabian families. That's Mr. Marenche in France. Now, with regards to the Ali Ajah story where Marenche wouldn't testify for the Italian authorities, nor would his 6 other personages, a gentleman involved in the shooting of the Pope and the disinformation about it that came from France was found murdered March the 12th, 1983. A while back I might have mentioned him, but it's appropriate now to talk about this man. He was a Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Nutt, and he was gunned down in France. He was murdered, and the newspapers, I'm citing the San Francisco Chronicle, March the 12th, the newspapers said that there were press reports in France and Italy that Nutt was involved in the arrest of the Soviet airline official who had been accused of spying in Rome, later cleared of all of that, and that he was the source of information about the famous link of May 13th, 1981, of the attack against the Pope. Lieutenant Colonel Nutt of France was responsible for the information about Ajah working for the KGB, and his thanks for setting out the disinformation and working with people like Michael Ledeen and Claire Sterling is that he was killed from a distance. There was no powder or gun, no trace of gunpowder on his face. Fragmented bullets made it difficult to determine if it had been fired. Of course, they wondered if it was a suicide, but he was pulled aside the road and supposedly waiting for somebody and who had a loaded gun, and he was gunned down. And this was the gentleman who was giving the disinformation. And as I say, this Ali Ajah, who was charged with shooting the Pope, got his money from Oral Celik, funded E.F. Hutton, Merrill Lynch. At the time, Reagan was just in office, and Mr. Marenche was the advisor and has been to Ronald Reagan foreign policy, oozing us on to World War III. And the way to do that would be to have the Bulgarian, Russian KGB shoot the Pope, kill the Pope, but even just shoot him. And it's had years of mileage. It's had all these years that there's still a chance that the Russians shot at the Pope, even though there never was a shred of evidence. Now, getting on to 3 or 4 articles that have to do with a man high up in public office, not holding public office, but the underbelly of the way our country is run. I want to share several articles with you about a man named Glenn Souham, Souham, who was murdered. And this is one of the few times that the newspapers covered the story that he was probably murdered because of what he did for the National Security Council. I cited last week one of those very rare articles about a couple that were bludgeoned in their home in Berkeley, and a doctor at the UC lab believed that there was a pattern of hitting and trying to kill civil rights activists who are kind to blacks who opposed the war in Vietnam. And the stories that came after Souham was murdered had the same tone to them. They didn't disguise the fact at all that working for the NSC is dangerous business. The first article on that comes from the Washington Times. They did a series that the other papers didn't carry. If you wonder why the papers that you see, the Monterey Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times, whatever you read, didn't have this, so this should be new for you if you don't read the Washington Times, and not many people do. I advise that you do, even though Reverend Moon publishes it, because he keeps up with the espionage parts of these stories. Arnaud de Borchgrave worked with the disinformation of the shooting of the Pope with Michael Ledeen, and was part of that Jonathan Institute that met in 1979 that I talked about. But these articles come out from the Washington Times, and they're very important because they have a knack of writing for agents, and they spell things out so that you know. Like they'll say, 2 liberals are appointed to the Intelligence Committee, where you won't see that kind of coverage as the Monterey Herald or the San Francisco Examiner and so forth. Well, before I get into the murder of Glenn Souham, we could take a 1-minute break and tell you that the second half of this program is a talk show. From that end of the first hour at 8 to 9, you can call in, make notes of things that I'm talking about, and call about those if you can think about it. I know it goes fast, but you must be hearing something that I'm saying. Sometimes I have material that's very important, and the calls are great, and I appreciate them, and they cover a wide range of subjects. But some of this stuff is material you're going to hear later, learn about, and it's important. Maybe the first time you hear it, it's a little strange to talk about, but the purpose of the talk show is anything you want to talk about. And so we'll be back together in another half hour, and then you can share what you've seen, read, heard during this past week or in the last couple of weeks or month or whatever. Meanwhile, I'll say this is Mae Brussell, in case you picked up at the beginning of the program. This is broadcast number 845, and I'll continue with the second half of World Watcher. The first article on Souham is titled, White House Quizzed on Ties to Slain Frenchman, Washington Times, and this came out December 18, 1986. A senior member of the National Security Staff, Michael Castine, and Ronald Reagan's appointment secretary, Frederick Ryan, who evidently took over when Helene von Daun went to Austria, were questioned by French authorities investigating the assassination of Glenn Souham, a French businessman who said he was doing work for the NSC. These 2 men went to Paris. Souham, 34, was ambushed, shot to death by 2 gunmen in Paris. There's belief he was killed because of his links to the White House. That's the way the article reads. I didn't make it up. Michael Castine, NSC Director of International Communications and Information, that's Charles Wick and U.S. Information, and Frederick Ryan, Deputy Assistant of the President. Both were in Paris recently. Souham led a colorful international life. He said he was meeting with a certain lieutenant colonel at the NSC. This could have been the key to his slaying. Paris officials said we're narrowing the investigation. We're getting to the target. It has to do because of his relations for the United States. Glenn may have gone to the United States and may have been dynamite for what he had to say with information may have been dynamite for the people who killed him. Now, Barbara Honegger's been talking about Paris meetings where there were arrangements to send money to Khomeini in order to get the hostages held back until Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. That was a Paris meeting that Cyrus Hashimi attended, and he was murdered in London. So we don't know what's going on in Paris. This was the headquarters of a lot of the arms to Iran, but he had information that may have killed him. NSC member Michael Castine said the French officials wanted to know because in Souham's apartment in Paris, he didn't expect to be gunned down. They found papers from the State Department and from Central America, unclassified documents. He traveled constantly, was involved in international real estate and oil. He was co-founder of a Paris-based security and bodyguard agency. He had famous friends and clients, one of them including financier Adnan Khashoggi. And Khashoggi had a bodyguard who was killed in Paris. Souham was close to Khashoggi, and the arms dealer who admitted that he played a major role in the secret sale of arms to Iran. Souham died, interestingly enough, just 1 week or the same week that Khashoggi was threatening William Casey that he was going to break the diversion money because he had put up $10 million for the first batch of arms to Iran, and he found out instead of being paid back, and Mr. Roy Furmack being paid back, that the money was going to the Contras instead of the $10 million they were going to give them. And the same week that Souham was killed in Paris is when Khashoggi forced the blackmail threats to Casey, who then took it to Mies, and Mies then had to go ahead and break the story about the diversion money. Khashoggi was mad, and he was a close friend of Glenn Souham. And Glenn told his friends that he was involved in the arms sales, that he had somehow tripped himself into what he said was a fatal mistake, and the French authorities haven't ruled out his role in the arms trade for being killed. This is from the Washington Times. He had official and social ties to the White House. He was President Reagan's special advisor on the President's Advisory Council to the private sector, investing private money into various, what turned out to be fronts for diverting money to the Contras in addition to other operations. He had relationships with the National Security Council. He talked about doing mysterious work for them, and associates and persons wondered if his close friends wondered if the NSC link was the cause of his death. He came from a family of successful and socially well-linked French businessmen, and the very day that Glenn Souham was murdered, his father was in the White House. The very day that he was gunned down in Paris, his father was in the White House with various persons on business deals that his son worked with. I wonder what kind of a coincidence that is. And he was affiliated with Souham Companies, his father's company, a diversified holding company, consulting services, and the security business provided him with influential people. He was a master at opening doors of the powerful and many in the United States. Now, I can't believe that he didn't know Mr. deMARENCHES, the man who was advising Ronald Reagan in the same city of Paris, when he was instrumental in getting weapons, and I'll go into that, out of Poland, working with Lech Walesa and Solidarity, and then working with the Contras. This Paris scene, as I say, was one of the meetings to send the money to Khomeini for the arms deals that would be going on continuously when Reagan was inaugurated. deMARENCHES there in Paris, head of the SDECE, so Souham had to be cleared or part of the operation of deMARENCHES. deMARENCHES was working, suggests, with the people that shot the Pope, Ali Ajah's benefactor, Oral Celik, and the connections in Paris seem that of course, the agency that deMARENCHES was head of, SDECE, the CIA's equivalent to ours, and deMARENCHES could go in and out of Reagan's life and out in California and meet him and advise him. Khashoggi was mentioned in the Lockheed scandals, working for the CIA and funneling money. Khashoggi, with Furmark, put up the money for the Iran-Contra affair. All this was going on in Paris, and money transferred, of course, wire services around the country. But Mr. Souham was close to all of these people. Souham, just before his murder, was recently made president of Walsh International, WALCH International, and he represented Walsh Corporation out of Charlotte, North Carolina, a real estate development that invested in Europe and the Middle East. The partner in Walsh International was a man named Dean Overman, managing partner in charge of a law firm of Winston and Strawn. You won't remember these names, but Souham was made president of a company called Walsh International, whose law offices were in Washington, D.C., Stephen Walsh and Dean Overman being the head lawyers. And it was Mr. Overman out of that office that introduced Souham to the Reagan White House. Now, Overman is now a law partner of Vice President Walter Mondale. Think of Walter Mondale and what happened at Jonestown when he was under Jimmy Carter. Walter Mondale is law partner with Overman, the man that first introduced Souham to the National Security Council. Now, that is really scary. 10 days after Souham was murdered, just 10 days after, Eugene Hasenfuss landed in Nicaragua. And the White House strategy memos say that they suggested that Walter Mondale or former Attorney General Griffin Bell get Hasenfuss out. They wanted one of these two Democrats, which I thought and mentioned on the air at the time was more than weird. And Mondale didn't go down, but Griffin Bell did. And Griffin Bell, as I've said, is on the board of E.F. Hutton, and he's the attorney for E.F. Hutton, the very firms that were sending money for Aja that went through Switzerland, that went to Mr. Oral Celik to Aja, and Mr. Marenche in Paris was wanted by the Italian authorities with 6 of his officials for the shooting of the Pope story. And Walter Mondale's law partner is the very man that represents Walsh International and Glenn Souham. And as I say, this law office must, having a Democrat there and a man so staunchly Republican, this is where Walter Mondale sits today. And it's very strange, but it explains why Walter Mondale never speaks up on a lot of important issues, particularly the Iran-Contra, because you see who his law partner is and how he's webbed into that operation. Mr. Overman, the partner of Mondale, also worked closely with President Gerald Ford. The old Warren Commission Ford, remember the one appointed by Crook Nixon to be president? He's associate director of the White House Domestic Council, and Mr. Overman, Deal Overman, is a partner with Souham, the same Glenn Souham that was gunned down, and he also was assistant to Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who was Deep Six conveniently just prior to the time when Ronald Reagan was nominated and became elected as president, and Rockefeller was nicely tucked under, 6 feet under the ground, very dead, and the Republican votes then went to Ronald Reagan. And when Mr. Overman learned of Souham's death, he thought right away it might be connected to the National Security Council. Well, if you're working with Gerald Ford and you buried Nelson Rockefeller, it's what else is new, I suppose, that one of your buddies is dead. And he said, well, it probably had to do with the NSC. Souham, as I say, worked for a certain lieutenant colonel. There were 2 lieutenant colonels in the National Security Council, but he met with someone from the White House in Paris in 1986, and this lieutenant colonel gave him all sorts of code words to use, and he described it as an intelligence operation. One friend suggested he might have played not only a role in the Iranian arms affairs, he seemed to, but also with the arming of the Contras. He was at both sides of the operation. Mr. Souham had 2 Swiss bank accounts where he was funding these operations. One of them was the same bank where the money went for the weapons to Iran was deposited in the name of Lake Resources. And the base for Lake Resources was in Panama, one of those Panama banks that Mr. Rodriguez was testifying about this last week. And Souham didn't use his name at the bank account. They used Mr. Walsh of Walsh International, law offices of Winston and Struan, and Dean Overman, who is a law partner of Walter Mondale. He had 2 passports, Mr. Souham, a French passport and one from Paraguay. Remember Nancy Reagan's housekeeper maid, the lady that selects her clothes or puts them out at night, who had almost 1 million rounds of ammunition to send to Paraguay. She was the translator for the arms sale. Down to Mr. Stroessner, who was reelected yesterday as the dictator of Paraguay for the umpteenth time. Well, Souham had a passport to Paraguay as if he were a Paraguayan citizen as well as French. And he also told people, according to this article, he knew his life was in danger. He told a friend 1 week before that he was in danger. He said some very mean people out there who you just don't want to cross up. And he said he made an unusually large amount of money the summer of 1985. And one of the important points about this that I forgot to say before I got to the French connection is that Mr. Rodriguez, testifying at the hearings this past week, made it very clear that money went to Paris almost weekly, at least every month or weekly, that money went from the Panamanian banks, and that he had money in accounts of the CIA they deposited, and the drug money went into the same banks, and the money came out of Panamanian banks and went to Paris regularly, if not weekly, monthly. Definitely Paris, he said. The money was going to Paris. So if the National Security Council and George Bush, with his drug connections with Noriega, this is why he's saying, hold on or whatever, the money from the CIA could go in the same accounts that Mr. Rodriguez was using and into the Panamanian banks, and then go directly to Paris to go to the likes of Mr. Souham, who was dealing with Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins and General Secord and Albert Hakim on the weapons deals that were to go down to the Contras and the operations out of Poland and Paris. And the bank they used was Lake Resources, and the funding of Lake Resources is the Udall Company were out of the Panama banks. As he said, I'll quote once more, he told friends, some very mean people out there that he's worked with, and you just don't want to cross up with them. He made an unusually large amount of money in the summer of '86. I made a very big deal, and I've made an enormous amount of money like I've never made before in my life, which sounds like the Panama Noriega deposits. And in return, what did he do? The People's Daily World had an article, People's Daily World, February 24th, 1987, by Carl Blois. Murder stalks Colonel North's French connections. And this is the way this story goes. After the Iran Gate scandal broke, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North said, in quotes, people who share his beliefs died face down in the mud because they held the line. Glenn Souham died face down in Paris, September 24th, 1986. And as I say, 11 days later, the Southern airplane went down. And he had connections to those very people. Souham was directly connected to President Reagan. He worked on his key projects. He was part of the private sector initiative, and he was part of the armed Nicaraguan counter-revolutionaries. Souham's murder is another in a series of violent deaths, possibly connected with the Iran Gate scandal, who have died untimely deaths since 1983. This is what Carl Blois said. And just to run off a few of them that I've detailed, some I've mentioned on the air, Souham is one I'm doing tonight and I haven't done with you before. Glenn Souham, National Security Council member Dr. Richard Beale, Senator Ed Zorinsky, who was making the ties to Nuganan Bank, NSC agent for the CIA and the arms Duran Cyrus Hashemi, Olof Palme and Carl Friedrich Algernon of Sweden because of arms being sent to Iran, NSC advisor Donald Fortier, Admiral Moreau, David, who was killed at John Hall's ranch in Costa Rica, Adler Barry Seal, Stephen Carr, the primary witnesses to the Christic suit, Dr. Schultz, the man in charge of Ollie North's psychological papers, Hugh Barschel of Germany, killed because of the arms Duran scandal, Colonel Nutt, killed in Paris, a part of the Ajah story linked to the National Security Council and Marench and Reagan's team, Santos Traficante, Edward Lansdale, Mike Burke, James Angleton, and William Casey, 5 of the biggest counterintelligence, Central Intelligence agents, 2 of them Knights of Malta, Angleton and Casey. All 5 died within just a few weeks' time. Some were old, yes, but Casey was just ready to testify the next day. It's very, I don't know what the mathematical chances are that all those particular drug dealing experts that did the drug traffic, the weapons, and the arms shipments all together died within this short time period. George Perry was linked to the arms to Iran. Nicholas Deek, who was gunned down in New York, and a news reporter in Lebanon who broke the story of the arms going to Iran, and the agent who told about the arms deals going to Khomeini had his head cut off, and a lawyer for OPIC, that's the Overseas Private Investment Company, was killed by John Hall's ranch. I'll go into that in one moment. And James Thurberger, the CIA agent that was George Bush's drug connections, I wonder about him. But Carl, that's just getting a few. He mentioned that a lot of people tied to this have died untimely deaths. I just mentioned 24 right off the top of my head. I wrote them down for you, but I have many files on these people and how they died and at what time. Now, Mr. Souham, according to this article, dealt in oil, real estate, and he was involved with international business and domestic affairs and foreign policy, and he was part of the president's, as I say, private sector initiative operation, and he made 2 trips to Grenada for the White House. A few months after the invasion, he was in Grenada, and he went back in 1986, and he preceded Reagan, and he arranged the flags and the demonstrations and made sure they were draped properly over the balconies. That photo opportunity of Reagan going to Grenada, Souham did that. Then he went back to Washington, the White House, where he personally was seen with Ronald Reagan. And he was directing when Reagan set up the private charities, the private sector initiatives. That means send arms to the Iranians, the Afghanistan, what he calls the freedom fighters, or Angola, make it look like charities. And we found what they were. They're really private sector, quote private sector, that belonged to the intelligence community closely linked to them. Michael Castine, as I say, from the National Security Council, worked with Souham, and Frederick Ryan worked closely with him. Frederick Ryan, the appointment secretary, was formerly head of OPSI, the Office of Private Sector, when he was working with Mr. Souham. And also Michael Castine of the NSC worked in the Office of Private Sector before he went on to National Security Council and worked with Glenn Souham. The New York Times, March 1983, said a special organization meeting was set up by Charles Wick, U.S. Information Agency, in 1983 of March to set up Project Democracy. Those would be the private sector people, and this was done through the White House and the Pentagon, meeting with people like John Singlaub and Fred Eakley, and I've detailed the likes of those people setting up what they call the private sector, which is just a big cover. The meeting of those private sector, in quotes, involved such people as Chicago businessman W. Clement Stone. Clement Stone was very much involved with Watergate and funding Dwight Chapin, the appointment secretary, until he got out of jail. He's part of a group in Texas that has put billions of dollars into turning the whole world Christian, and he works with Bum Bright of Texas from Young Americans for Freedom, who was involved with the murder of John Kennedy with General Walker and bringing the YF people from Munich, Germany for the time of the Kennedy murder. Clement Stone is part of the Project Democracy private sector that Souham operated. Also, Rupert Murdoch was part of that. Rupert Murdoch came here from Australia. He bought up the Chicago Tribune. If you remember, maybe you don't, I had it on the air because, according to Mike Royko, he didn't want any more articles about Jonestown, and he didn't want anything about Edwin Meese's confirmation. Well, Edwin Meese turned out to be a disaster, and Mr. Souham, working with the private sector, worked with Murdoch. Murdoch came to California and bought 20th Century Fox. And recently he's been confronting the powers that be in Washington, wanting to buy a newspaper in Boston. Murdoch couldn't buy 20th Century Fox because he owned television studios and newspapers in the motion picture studio. It was too much property for one man to own, who came from Great Britain, originally Australia, not an American citizen. And there was a question about his being able to buy all the media that he did in Los Angeles, which is worldwide media because 20th Century makes photos for the whole world. So that was solved. The problem went to Ronald Reagan, and in 24 hours, Rupert Murdoch was made an American citizen. That's the gentleman that wants to buy the newspapers and push Ted Kennedy out of the political scene in Boston. So these people were on the committee with Souham. Those are just a couple of them. The article, Murder Stalks Colonel North's French Connection. That's no exaggeration. Another story, June 25th, 1987, out of the Washington Times again by John McCason, titled Polish Contra Arms Cited in Paris Slaying, and this gets even heavier. Agents in the Eastern European government may have assassinated, again like the KGB or whatever, the Eastern agents may have assassinated Mr. Souham because he was helping Oliver North get arms from Poland to the Nicaragua resistance. Souham, according to Washington Magazine, printed in June and July of 1987, said that Glenn Souham helped Oliver North, so you know which lieutenant colonel it is, to work with the Polish trade union Solidarity. Members of Solidarity helped with elaborate schemes to smuggle weapons to the Contras. Pope John Paul II was caught giving $50 million to Lech Walesa for Solidarity, and we hear about all the poverty or the problems in Poland and the oppression under the communists, and here is Lech Walesa working with Oliver North's agent Glenn Souham Souham. And according to these articles in the Washington Times, Colonel North told him 2 weeks after Souham was killed that supplying those arms again was the quotation, serious business. He was getting them out of Poland. The Israeli officials turned down the effort to supply the Contras, the batch that Oliver North wanted, with untraceable arms. But North then went to the CIA and to the NSC and made his connections to Souham, living in Paris. And again, Mr. deMARENCHES of the French CIA, the SDECE, right there in Paris, they had those connections to the United States. So North supplies started for the Contras. The outlawed Polish trade union had enough weapons to spare. The Sandinistas were outfitted with Soviet-made and Eastern Bloc weapons. So every time you see somebody dead, they can throw it on the ground and say, look at the weapons the Sandinistas got. And they felt the Sandinistas had Russian weapons, so therefore the Contras did have similar weapons. And as I say, drop them and say, look at all these weapons the Sandinistas have. According to this article, the Soviet weapons are more simple to operate, and Souham had channels in Poland, the eastern part of Europe. And so he had false identification documents and papers made for people in Poland, provided by North and the CIA, given to the Solidarity leaders. They gave them their supporters in the Polish railway station. They used phony documents. They got Soviet arms from the Polish army. They were diverted to East Germany. And then the weapons, the AKM assault rifles, the SA-7 missiles were smuggled into West Germany. And then the officials were bribed by Western agents and local officials. And then the arms were shipped to warehouses in Honduras and then supplied to the Contras. And when North was asked whether or not to deny these allegations that came in Washington Magazine, he said, I have no comment because my attorney, Mr. Brendan Sullivan, will shoot me if I keep talking. So these are the weapons that were purchased through Secord and Hakim, through the same banks that Souham had in Paris. And you can see why this guy had to be shot very soon after, or just before these stories began to be unglued. I had a lot of reason to believe that Hassenfuss took a parachute and got out of the airplane, and this story began to unfold for various reasons that persons wanted it to happen, and an agent provocateur situation that pulled certain people down and out of office and left others looking squeaky clean, like Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the elder statesmen who hang around and give their opinions on different problems while they watch these other people dying and squirming around to defend themselves. So just 11 days before the Nicaraguan operation, this Mr. Souham was gunned down in Paris. Another story in the Washington Times, slain Frenchman met Reagan in 1984. Glenn Souham was in the White House meeting Reagan. The White House was well aware of his first visit to Grenada in 1984. The trip to Grenada was sponsored by the OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Company. He was advisor to the White House. Now, the OPIC that he worked on the board, is the same company, and I'm running out of time, I'll have to do this next week, that Edwin Meese was using for the Iraqi pipeline. This is the same company that I mentioned on these programs. Money going over $300,000 to John Hall's ranch in Costa Rica. Glenn Souham represented. His trip was sponsored by the OPIC, the Office of Private Investment Company. Souham was an advisor to the White House on not only the private sector, but this very company, and worked for them. And the White House confirmed that his father, as I say, Gerard Souham, was meeting with White House officials, the administration officials, the very instant that his son was gunned down. And this is the Washington Times, December 19th, at the White House. They confirmed at the instant his son was gunned down in Paris on September the 24th, 1986. His father, Gerard Souham, was meeting at the White House with administration officials, and this son was working with the OPIC, the very agency that Edwin Meese is in trouble now with, and may even not only be removed from office, but there may be many consequences following this. On World Watchers number 830, I talked about OPIC and the pipeline to Iraq, and also referred to John Hall getting $375,000 carried by Robert Owen, working for the same agency. I'll do more on OPIC next week with you, but there's a long article in the Washington Post, February the 2nd. Tiny agency welcomes relief from obscurity. Meese controversy spotlights the OPIC, and Glenn Souham worked for that agency. And this article says that the late Senator Frank Church objected to this agency, that most of the funding, 41%, went to 11 multinational companies, including Dow Chemical, W.R. Grace, and J.P. Morgan, that they got the bulk of the insurance from that company. Now, that is a lot on the French Connection for you to think about or digest, of the deaths and the interlocking links, not only to the shooting of the Pope and Mr. Demarènches and Ronald Reagan's contacts in Paris, and this gentleman who worked with Ollie North, Secor and Hakim, the same banks they used. And for whatever reason, at that moment in history, they decided it was time to do away with Mr. Souham at the instant, the very time that his father was in the White House. These people really are too much, I'll tell you. To see them operate with each other is pretty gruesome. But as Mr. Rodriguez says, if you've got a cause, you have to do some very unconscionable things. If you've got a cause, that's all that matters. So with that, we'll conclude the first hour of World Watchers so that then you get your chance to call about these things. I want to say that this hour World Watchers was made possible in part by Aries Arts, in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. And also the views expressed here are those of myself, Mae Brussell, and they do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors. And with that,